Democracy is dying across the world. It is in the last stage of terminal cancer, and there's one big reason for it. It is the rise of AI, which is ensuring that big businesses and their billionaire owners no longer need democracy to stay in power or to make money. To understand that, you might sound it a little odd, so we'll have to rewind a few centuries to when capitalism as a system was first beginning to emerge. This was the time of kings, nobles, feudal lords of some sort or the other. In India, we had the Jagirdars and the Zamindars, the Jotdars. The defining characteristic of the system, however, was not the landlord. It was actually the people who worked under them, mostly farmers, but many artisans as well. So what defined their relationship was the unpaid free labor they got. They had to do some amount of work for free for their lord. In North India, we know this as Begaar, which still continues, by the way, in some places. The Zamindar in India, the feudal lord in Europe, had a right over other people's unpaid labor, and often it was a hereditary right. Sometimes a peasant or worker might have to pay off their loans through unpaid labor, and that is something that we have known till very recently as bonded labor, an obligation which would pass down over generations. And I'm a little ashamed to say that my own ancestors had bonded laborers working on their fields in East Bengal, what is now Bangladesh, as late as the 1920s. Interestingly, one of those bonded laboring families now own the land that belonged to my father's family, and I think rightly so. As is obvious, such a system works on social hierarchy. If the working people do not internalize this hierarchy, that somehow they are not full owners of their own bodies, that they do not own their own ability to do labor, that part of it naturally belongs to the Lord, then such an unfair system simply cannot survive. So all such systems which came before capitalism were intrinsically undemocratic. So why did capitalism bring democracy along with it? Feudal lords and zamindars earned rent from their land. They didn't care if the crop failed. The peasants starved, but they had to give up all they had produced. Chahe kuch bhi ho jaye, lagan to dena hi padta tha. And in years of bumper harvest, the landlord took away everything that was extra, so they could extract more. So neither the landlord nor the peasant had any reason to increase production. Now imagine you're a trader in this kind of a system. You make money by buying things from one place, from grains to fine silks, and then transport it across regions and then sell it somewhere else. Now, over a few seasons, you realize that people in the western coastal regions of the Indian subcontinent want to buy more muslin from Bengal. So you tie up with an artisan in East Bengal and ask him to produce more muslin. If this were today, the artisan would contract a few farmers to grow more cotton, hire more weavers, and increase his muslin output. But back then, it wouldn't have been possible at all. Why? Because farmers had to produce what the landlord wanted, whatever the landlord wanted as rent. And workers were also tied to their lords. They were not free to work for others. So it was in the interest of the artisan and the trader to push for reforms that would free up the workers to be able to work for anyone they wanted. Historically, across the world, this political process through which peasants and artisans acquired the right to own their own bodies and sell their ability to do labor to anyone was also accompanied by another process, the slow expulsion of farmers from their land. So the workers became free to sell their labor power to anyone they wanted, but they also no longer had access to productive resources like land to become self-employed. The capitalist and the worker came across each other in the marketplace, one owning capital, funds, factories, machines, and raw materials, the other owning their ability to do labor or their labor power. In the marketplace, both confronted each other as equal owners of goods and services that they were willing to sell to each other. The capitalists bought what the workers sold, which was their labor power, for a fixed period of time, and in exchange paid them wages. Note, the capitalists had no right to unpaid labor, and the worker used those wages to buy goods and services from the capitalists. Both sides were free not to sell to the other or to buy from the other. So at the level of the market, the fundamental basis of capitalist societies, both the capitalist and the worker appear to be equals, with full liberty to do what they please. This idea didn't emerge overnight. It took decades to find acceptance. And in many cases, the rising capitalist class had to violently overthrow the old feudal aristocracy. The most famous of these, as you know, is the French Revolution that took place in the last decade of the 18th century. And its ideologues Proponents of free trade, liberty, and equality, people like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, also took many decades to dominate public opinion. This is the fundamental connection between the rise of capitalism and the simultaneous rise of modern liberal democracy. By the way, in most places, very soon, the rising capitalist class realized that too much democracy will be bad for them. So, in most parts of Europe, they came to an understanding with the aristocracy, a sort of compromise. So, don't think that capitalism automatically gave the vote to everyone. That had to be fought for by the working classes through a series of insurrections and revolutions that affected Europe throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, because of which this was called the Age of Revolutions. In fact, universal adult franchise only emerged in the early 1900s. Before that, elections were held, but only those with property or who paid some taxes or were educated were allowed to vote. Women were among the last to get the right to vote, and they had to fight for it. In Switzerland, they got it as late as 1971. In fact, America, the so-called land of the free, didn't have real universal adult franchise till 1965, 18 years after we got it here in India. Till then, several states in the USA had local laws which stopped African Americans and minorities from voting. It was only the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965 which made such laws illegal and finally gave African Americans their full voting rights. And now Donald Trump is again trying to bring in new laws to stop African Americans from voting. He has issued an executive order which says that people will need to show a DPOC, or documentary proof of citizenship, to be able to register to vote. And about 20 million Americans, most of them low-income African Americans and Hispanics, currently do not have such documentation, so they might not be able to vote. But before I go on further, a quick appeal to all of you. If you have liked this video till now, do subscribe to my channel so that you get to see much more. Okay, let's continue. Now, don't think that the universal right to vote, whether you're rich or poor, educated or illiterate, powerful or not, don't think that this right was somehow granted to the working classes because the ruling classes suddenly became very kind and liberal in the early 20th century and they saw the light and suddenly wanted justice for all. No. One key reason was the fear of communist revolutions, which were threatening to erupt across Europe in the late 19th century and the 20th century, right? The beginning of the 20th century. Now, this fear turned into complete paranoia when the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia in 1917 and murdered the Tsar and his family. So, everywhere in the West, ruling groups decided to give more rights to the workers and the poor. This process accelerated after World War II, after Hitler was defeated. In fact, even before that, during the war itself, the working people of the Allied nations had been promised a better tomorrow if they went to fight for their country, right? Politicians had promised to take care of their families and children if they died in the war. In England, for example, this was formally laid out in the Beveridge Report, published in November 1942, right in the middle of the war, which promised welfare and social security for all. This report laid the foundations of the post-war welfare state in Britain and the establishment of the National Health Service, NHS, which provides free healthcare to all even now. Similar welfare measures were extended in other European countries and even in the USA. And it is important to note that several European nations like France, Italy, Greece and Belgium, all of these had their first complete election based on universal franchise only around the end of the Second World War. In fact, Spain and Portugal continued to have authoritarian governments with no elections till the late 1970s. So full electoral democracy has had a very, very short history even in the West, which prides itself on being the home of liberal democracy. But there was yet another twist or turn in the story in the 1980s when the welfare state began to collapse across the world. Why did that happen? That's an entirely different matter, and I will do at least one video on it soon and hopefully a series. The fact was that the profits of big business had fallen sharply by the late 1970s and wages had risen dramatically. In the USA, for instance, in 1940, the richest 1% of people earned 21% of the country's national income, and the poorest 50% earned just 14%. By 1980, welfarism had reversed this completely. The richest 1% now earned only 10% of the national income, while the poorest 50% owned twice that much, 20%. No wonder the capitalist class was desperate for a change and desperate for a solution to their falling profits. This solution was provided by Ronald Reagan in the US and Margaret Thatcher in the UK. The first thing they did was to pass laws that would weaken labor unions and make it easier to sack workers. The second thing was to liberalize finance, make it much easier to move money from the developed West to other countries, especially the third world. The third was to open doors to China and allow American companies to shift their manufacturing there to China. It is interesting to note that even though China was a communist country, it boycotted the 1980 Olympics held in Moscow during the time of the USSR and only made its debut in the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles in the USA. By moving manufacturing to China and using its cheap labor to produce things, American companies gradually made their own workers redundant. In fact, real wages of the average American worker did not rise for nearly 4 decades from the 1980s. The state became increasingly harsh with the poor, especially African Americans. And between this increase in the 80s, between the 1960s and early 2000s, the rate of incarceration of African American men, that is how many of them were locked away in prisons, rose 4 times. From roughly 1,300 per 100,000 to around 5,200 per 100,000 in 2001. So democracy was slowly being whittled down in the USA for the past 20 years. Those of you who are old enough to remember the 2000 elections will remember how African Americans were disqualified in the presidential elections back then in Georgia and Florida. And that is the only reason George W. Bush became president. So from the mid-1980s, big business in the West was increasingly becoming less dependent on its local working class to make goods and earn profits. They had exported that to China. The computer revolution of the 1990s made even lower-level office workers less essential. They were first replaced by software, which pushed down their wages, and then by Indians sitting in Hyderabad and Bengaluru. All of this was made possible through deregulation of finance, allowing capital to flow from the West to China, India, and other parts of the third world. Another set of economic reforms was to reduce the role of the public sector in the economy and privatize public companies and also sell public assets to private companies. Along with that, tariff walls were brought down so that goods manufactured in China could be brought into the USA and sold at low prices to American consumers, and American goods could go outside. Remember that the average American worker was being paid much less than before. But cheap goods coming in from China made sure their purchasing power stayed more or less intact, even though it didn't rise anymore. Together, we know these 3 processes as liberalization, privatization, and globalization, the LPG reforms. It didn't happen naturally, nor did it happen overnight. It was done through a series of deliberate policies introduced by successive governments in large democracies, from the USA to India. And just as the rise of liberal ideas that the capitalists wanted in the 18th and 19th century was pushed along by ideologues like Smith and Rousseau, the ideology of globalization and privatization was pushed by ideologues too. Most important of them were the neoclassical, neoliberal, Nobel Prize winning economists, along with all the hundreds of TV experts and newspaper columnists. Its impact was to dramatically increase inequality in most countries, concentrating income and wealth in the hands of a few. As I said earlier, in the USA, in 1980, the richest 1% earned 10% of the national income, and the poorest 50% earned more than 20%. By 2023, this had completely changed. The richest 1% now earned 21% of the nation's income, while the share of the poorest 50% had fallen to 13%. This immense concentration of wealth has meant that the billionaires today control everything, from presidencies to state institutions, from university curricula to the media. And now they've moved one step forward. The tech billionaires are pushing us towards a world where all employees will be gradually replaced by AI, where entrepreneurs won't need human workers nor have to pay any wages. All they will need are subscriptions to AI agents. At least that's what they're dreaming. And as they don't need workers anymore, the tech oligarchs who are now ruling the US and try to capture much of the world no longer need electoral democracy either. It is in their interest to take over the institutions of democratic states from bureaucracies to courts and even the defense forces. And it is in our interest to fight them. Once again, if you enjoyed watching this video, please like, share, and most importantly, please comment. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel and click on the bell icon so that you get to know each time a new video drops.